Good day, everyone, and it's good to be with you again on this Thursday, and I hope you're having a wonderful week. Myself, I've not had a great week. On Tuesday, I did something to my back. My back gave out. I just got out of a chair. I wasn't even doing anything, and my back just something snapped, and now my back's hurting pretty bad. So, it's happened to me many times. I know it'll be all right in a few days, and I'll be able to preach this Sunday. It's just it'll be the difference of preaching with a smile or preaching with a grimace. So you'll know how my back is feeling on Sunday for sure. But I'm pretty sure by Thursday, or by Sunday anyway, today's Thursday, by Sunday that things will be quite a bit better. Since it happened on Tuesday, I can already tell things are getting better. But if you see me give a little wince or something, it might be because I shifted my rear end, and in doing so, it may have caused a little twinge in my back. But anyway, let's get started on our Gospel of Matthew study. And today I kind of want to almost finish up chapter 13. There's a little part at the very end about Jesus teaching in Nazareth. I'm going to save that for next week, and really that gets us going into chapter 14. But I want to look at a lot of these loose parts that I've kind of skipped over in chapter 13. So I want to look at verses 10 through 16 in chapter 13. Then I also want to look at verses 31 through 33, and then 34 through 35, and then 44 through 45, and 51 through 52. So basically we have 4 short parables, another short saying, or maybe a parable, and then I want to talk about the use of a couple Old Testament passages here. So that's kind of what we're doing. So initially I want to talk about, as I said, verses 10 through 16. So if you want to go ahead and stop and read all those passages that I talked about, or just read the rest, read chapter 13 again to refamiliarize yourself, that would be great. But go ahead and stop the video and read that, and then we'll pick up. All right. So Jesus has been using parables throughout this chapter. There weren't any parables before this. There'll be a few parables after, but not very many. But this is basically a parable chapter in the Gospel of Matthew. Now, parables in themselves, are not peculiar to the ministry of Jesus. I mean, Jewish people are using parables for quite some time. In fact, we could go back into even the days of the Hebrew people. Jewish people are a sect of the Hebrew people. But anyway, go back before some of the downfalls of Israel, and you have a united kingdom under King David, and David made a mistake, and Nathan confronted him with a parable to explain to him the mistake about his adulterous sin activity with Bathsheba. So there are parables in the Old Testament. Now, the way the Jewish people thought of it, though, is a little bit different than the way we think of it. I know a lot of people have tended to say parables are heavenly stories or earthly stories with heavenly meanings. That's right, earthly stories with heavenly meanings. Well, it sounds cute. It's just a little bit oversimplistic. Parables are much more than just that. And for the Jewish people, in fact, the Hebrew word that is used, because the word parables is a Greek word, and it shows up in the Old Testament some, is mashal. And mashal is the idea of riddles or wisdom sayings, that kind of idea. So they thought of this as a way to express wisdom. And so they look at it differently than what we do. Now, for the Greek culture, they understood the power of stories. In fact, the Greeks would have understood its usefulness in delivery of some kind of speech. When you're trying to convince people, you may use analogies, or if you're trying to defend yourself, you may use analogies. And these analogies would be something to support your point, and that would be their parable. And so for them, they were analogies that had some kind of wisdom attached to it that could support their rhetorical points. So there's differences between the cultures. For Jesus, it's more about riddles, this kind of idea of riddles. And so now Jewish rabbis have been doing this for a while, as I said, so it's nothing new to Jesus. He's just doing something that they're very accustomed to. Now, in verses 10 through 16, he quotes from, and let me pull up my text, he quotes from the prophet Isaiah. In fact, it's Isaiah 9 and 10 is where he's quoting from. And if you're familiar with Isaiah, or you could go back and read chapter 6, chapter 6 of Isaiah seems to be the beginning point of the ministry of Isaiah. In fact, God says, hey, I need somebody to go. Who will go? And Isaiah says, Send me. Here I am. Send me. And so this is part of the conversation that occurs between God and Isaiah. And so God tells Isaiah that in his ministry it's going to be very, very hard. He's going to go out and tell things to people, tell them what they need to do, and they're not going to trust him, and they're not going to heed his advice. And so it kind of tells about the disappointment, to some degree, that the Hebrew people, Jewish people, were to God in the ministry of Isaiah. During the ministry of Isaiah, Assyria comes in and wipes out the northern kingdom of Israel. The southern kingdom is almost decimated by Assyria. If it wasn't for Hezekiah making a repentant change, that's the only thing that spares Jerusalem. And so they won't listen. In fact, this comes out of chapter 6 of Isaiah, as I said. And in chapter 7 of Isaiah, you have a specific example of a king. His name is Ahaz, who will not listen to Isaiah, refuses to listen. And so Jesus applies this to himself. They will refuse to listen also. Now, if you go down just a little bit, I want to look at the other part of this where he talks about these parables, and it's in verses 34 and 35. Here he uses Psalm 78, verse 2. Now, real quickly about that psalm. The way that the Hebrew/Jewish people thought of a prophet is much differently than what we think of a prophet, and I prefer to think along the ways of the Hebrew-Jewish people, because that's where the idea originated from. And it carries over. It's not until people misunderstand this that they start applying this forecasting idea predominantly to prophecy or prophets, that kind of idea. A prophet is just a person who has revelation from God and shares it to people. So this is a quotation from Psalm 78. The person that's attributed to the psalm for writing it is Asaph. We know nothing about Asaph. Yet here he's called a prophet. Not meaning like he's forecasting something. In fact, the psalm is not about forecasting anything. Psalm 78 is a retelling of Israel's history, going back to the enslavement in Egypt and how God brought them out of Egypt with miracles and displays of power. The frustrations that God had with the people in the wilderness journeys. It talks about them going into the promised land, and while they're in there, there's the problem. The sin still is a major problem for the people. And God is dealing with this, and then it eventually leads to David. He talks about David being the great shepherd that the people needed at that time. And so it really is like an exaltation of David as being the shepherd. And so it talks about the idea of these riddles in this Psalm 78 verse 2. But anyway, it's parallelism that's being used there. But the idea here is that the use of Psalm 78 makes me think that David was a shepherd for the people, the old covenant. Well, now we have this same kind of idea coming out of Psalm 78, but it applies to Jesus now in this new covenant mix. Jesus will be the one who is a shepherd for the people. And so that's why he is using these passages as it is. And sadly, as I said, Jesus is being, he's being overlooked. The people have basically refused to accept him as Messiah. They've definitely refused his divine nature. And so, in a sense, when we get to chapter 13 in the Gospel of Matthew, we have Jesus being very frustrated and agitated about what he is encountering. Now, I don't think he expected this. In fact, I think we need to be careful about using the godly abilities of Jesus at all times. We need to be careful about foreknowledge, but necessarily when he's in this human form, he may curtail that to some. But anyway, we are starting to see some kind of frustration in the ministry of Jesus, even though there are crowds following him to a large degree. The religious order, the ones who should have really seen Jesus for who he is, they failed. And so he is being very, very sad, I guess, to some degree. But then he praises those who are following him because this information is going to be given to them. And there's going to be some more of this coming up a little bit later, but so they're the disciples that are following him, and it's much more than just the 12. There are many, many more. We don't know how many, but there are several. And they probably followed him a little bit for a while, then they would probably leave and go home and take care of some things and maybe come back or so forth. It's probably like that. It's probably seasonal to a great degree. But anyway, he is teaching those people. They are being discipled, and they are given information that should be exciting to all people, but the religious leaders are not, for some reason. Well, they've denied Jesus, and they're not excited about what he has to offer. All right, let's look at verses 31 through 33 then real quick. Parable about growth. It talks about the mustard seed being the smallest of all seeds. I want to talk about that just for a moment, just to clear up some things. The mustard seed is not the smallest of all the seeds. It's only the smallest of the seeds that's being used in this context of this garden. It's the smallest that guy has. In fact, mustard seeds there's many, many smaller seeds out there. This is the problem when people talk about, understanding the Bible literally. They would think like, well, it says it's the smallest, so it has to be all the smallest. Well, it's not that way. There are many things to consider when you're reading information. And so we don't take things literally. We take things as the author intended for the information to be transmitted. That's what we have to do. And so we've got to understand what's going on in that culture. We got to look back maybe at the language to see if it's being translated correctly. Many times it could be a translation problem, and that happens quite a bit. But anyway, we don't have that idea. In fact, you can't even apply that kind of literal idea. I read the Bible literally to many of the literary genres within the Bible itself. You can't do it to Revelation. You can't do it to many parts of the Old Testament because the symbolism of that type of writing is being presented. Apocalyptic style writing, or some kind of poetic type of writing. We don't treat it that way. We treat it as the author of that material, however he wrote it, intended to convey the information. We try to understand it along those means. Now, these two parables about the mustard seed and about the leaven are about growth. So, we could think broadly or we could think inwardly. Now, real quick, before I expound upon those two ideas real quickly, I do want you to understand the parable of the mustard seed and it growing into this tree and all the birds of the air coming in to live in it is also a retransmission of imagery that comes out of Daniel chapter 4. In fact, King Nebuchadnezzar has some kind of a dream, and Daniel has to interpret it to him. It talks about all the birds of the air nesting in this tree, this kind of idea. Well, in the kingdom of God, basically it's going to provide for all people, but that imagery comes back. Now, the leaven courses its way through stuff, and it grows, it expands. Now, I talked about this being broadly or inwardly, the kingdom of God expansion. So we can think broadly. We can think about the expansion of the kingdom of God as we tell more people and get more people involved. That's very applicable. Explaining the kingdom of God among people, broadly. Or you could think inwardly too. Is there an expansion of God's kingdom within the person? And the reason why I bring that up is we are to be growing people. The process of sanctification is a process of growth. We are called disciples because we are supposed to be growing. That's the kind of idea that comes. And so this could explain some of the problems of two of the seeds from the parable of the sower or the seeds. Remember, there's only one seed that makes it, three that don't, and three that don't. And two of the three that don't maybe could have. Seems like they were able to get anchored into the ground, get a little bit of root, start to flourish, and then something happened and they died. Okay? And so if we think about that, that could be the idea of someone received that gospel message, that seed. It took root in their heart, but it didn't expand. It didn't grow. Other things happened. And so there was no inward growth within that person. That's why it's so important in the church for teaching. And it has to be correct teaching. But teaching is so important. And also the idea of accountability. And all these ideas, learning and being accountable, that's what we practice in church. We practice loving accountability, but But the idea of church and being a part of church is so very crucial for the Christian, for this idea of kingdom growth within ourselves. Now, let's go down here and look at this parable of the hidden treasure, the parable of the great value. This could also explain some things maybe out of why some of those seeds failed in the parable of the sower. But we have these two parables, and basically it's the idea that these people recognize some kind of treasure, something that's very, very valuable, and they do all that they can to acquire that, to get that treasure. So it's a recognition about the value of God's kingdom, and the idea of forsaking everything else and seeking God's kingdom as a treasure, that kind of idea, putting God first, that kind of idea, and putting everything else behind you. Now we think about the parable of the sower again. Maybe a shallow appreciation of God's salvation message is part of the problem. Maybe they didn't really understand the value of the kingdom. Then there were other things that they considered to be of greater value that kind of pulled them away. Again, to overcome that is to teach. Initially, when you're teaching people about the gospel, you have got to teach the need of salvation very well. You have to explain why. Why do you need salvation? Well, here's why. Understand, and also understand the cost or the effort that God put forth for us to have this gospel salvation plan that we have. And so when we share it well, others should understand its value, its great value, and have a greater appreciation of it. Now also, let's look at verses 51 through 52, and this will be it. So this is about the old treasures and the new treasures. I don't know if it's a parable. I don't think it's a parable. I just kind of consider it to be some kind of a wisdom saying. But anyway, he's talking to the disciples. It's directed to the disciples, but Jesus calls them scribes. Now, why would he call them scribes? These people most likely cannot read and write. A scribe would have to be able to read and write. Jesus is using this word scribe metaphorically. Scribes could read and write, but they were also the teachers under the old covenant. They taught people. And so Jesus saying this to disciples, basically saying to them is that you are going to be the ones who carry this message forward. You are going to be the ones who teach. And as you're teaching about the kingdom, understand that there are carryovers from the old covenant to the new covenant. It never was the idea like the old covenant was just done away with, like it was a bad idea and just thrown out the window or something. No, it moved us to the new covenant. Now, there's lots of things in the old covenant that we don't practice anymore. We don't practice animal sacrifices. That's the big thing. Why? Well, we have Jesus as our sacrifice. We don't practice the dietary restrictions. Well, why? Because most of that stuff had to do with pagan practices and other among other peoples, and so we don't have those problems anymore. There was the Sabbath. That's one of the only commandment that is not carried over, the Ten Commandments. That is the only commandment that's not carried over into the New Testament. So it's not applicable. It doesn't. There's no restricting us of anything about having to worship on the Sabbath or not having to worship on the Sabbath or having a rest day. In fact, we're not even commanded to have a rest in the New Testament. You can work 7 days a week. Well, why? Because everybody did back then, and so except for the Jewish people. So they basically talking about the old covenant, the good things. There's many things in the old covenant that are very, very good that carried forward. Many of the moral practices carry forward. Covenant people have to act morally pure, morally responsible. So you do bring those out, and they do occur into the new covenant. In fact, the new covenant is built upon the old covenant, and we couldn't understand the purpose of the new covenant without the old covenant, but we also could not really have this transition, a smooth transition from the old covenant to the new covenant without a good understanding of what the purpose of the old covenant was, is to provide some kind of communal relations between God and people. And now we have that in the new covenant. It's better in the new covenant because it's through Jesus, but again, many of those great principles in the old covenant carry forward into the new covenant also. Alrighty, well, that's all I have for this week. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I hope my back gets better. I will be preaching on Sunday, don't worry about that. It's just like I said, I'll either be preaching with a smile on my face or maybe a grimace here and there as I shift and maybe something happens, but I'll be fine. Just pray for me that I get over this pretty quickly. Usually it takes 4 or 5 days, and I kind of get back to normal. So hopefully that's the way it'll be this way also. So I hope you guys have a great day, and I look forward to seeing you on Sunday. Bye-bye.